She stole that uniform. My father's voice cracked through the Fairfax County courtroom like a rifle shot. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Not the clerk. Not the bailiff. Not even Judge Robert Halstead, whose reading glasses had frozen halfway down his nose as he stared over the bench at the man shouting from the plaintiff's table. My father stood trembling, one finger pointed straight at my chest. The gold trim on my navy dress whites caught the afternoon light from the courthouse windows bright enough to sting the eye. "That woman is a fraud," he barked. "She stole that uniform and she's trying to steal my family's land." Whispers rippled through the gallery. I heard my name pass from mouth to mouth like a rumor too scandalous to keep quiet. Abigail Mercer. Frank Mercer's runaway daughter. The girl who'd vanished 12 years ago and come back wearing honors no one in Cedar Ridge, Virginia believed she'd earned. My attorney, Margaret Bell, didn't flinch. She sat beside me at the defense table, her silver hair perfectly arranged, one hand folded over a yellow legal pad. If she felt any surprise at my father's outburst, she hid it well. I kept my face still. That had taken years to learn. You don't survive military service by reacting to every insult thrown your way. You learn stillness. Stillness unnerves people. Across the aisle, my younger brother Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking smug enough to choke on. He wore a navy blazer and the same crooked smile he'd worn at 16 when he'd convinced our father I'd broken the taillight on his truck. Some things never changed. Judge Halstead cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer, this is a court of law, not your church social hall. Sit down." Father lowered himself slowly, but his eyes stayed fixed on me. They were pale blue, the same shade as mine, though his had long ago hardened into something cold and suspicious. For a moment I saw him exactly as he'd looked the day I left home, standing on the farmhouse porch with his jaw clenched, telling me if I walked away to join the Navy I needn't bother coming back. That had been 12 years ago. Long enough for my mother to die. Long enough for Daniel to inherit Father's easy affection. Long enough for me to become someone neither of them could imagine. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish. Outside, late September sunlight slanted across the courthouse lawn, where red and gold leaves had begun to fall. It was the kind of Virginia afternoon my mother used to love. The kind she'd spend on the porch swing with a glass of sweet tea, watching the world turn slow and golden. I wondered what she'd think if she could see this. Her husband accusing her daughter of fraud. Her son sitting smug and silent. Her family reduced to a property dispute over 87 acres of Mercer land and the truth buried beneath it. Margaret rose. "Your Honor, if the plaintiff is finished with theatrics, the defense would like to proceed." Judge Halstead gave a short nod. "Proceed." Margaret turned toward the bench. "Mrs. Eleanor Mercer amended her will 6 months before her death. The amendment grants equal ownership of the Cedar Ridge property to both her children." Daniel's smile vanished. Father's knuckles whitened around the edge of counsel table. "That amendment was forged," Father snapped. Margaret didn't look at him. "We have notarized copies and corroborating testimony." "That girl disappeared for over a decade," Father said. "No calls, no visits, no funeral attendance when her own mother died." "That one landed." "Not visibly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I felt it. A quiet blade turning where old grief still lived. I hadn't missed my mother's funeral by choice. I'd been halfway around the world on orders I couldn't break and missions I couldn't explain. By the time the message reached me, she was already buried beneath the maple tree she'd chosen herself. Father knew that. Or he'd chosen not to know. Margaret glanced toward me, then back to the judge. "My client was serving this country under conditions protected by federal classification." Father laughed bitterly. "Oh, that's rich." The gallery stirred again. This was small-town Virginia. People here believed military service was sacred, but only when they understood it. A woman gone 12 years who suddenly returned decorated and composed. That unsettled them. It didn't fit their understanding of how life worked. Judge Halstead folded his hands. "Mrs. Bell, unless you can provide documentation." The courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. A young Marine courier stepped inside carrying a sealed navy blue dispatch envelope stamped in red. "Urgent, eyes only." The room fell silent. The Marine crossed directly to Margaret's table, saluted me crisply, then handed her the envelope. No expression. No hesitation. Just duty. Margaret accepted it as calmly as if she'd expected him. Because she had. She walked to the bench and handed it to Judge Halstead. This, she said quietly, is the documentation. The judge frowned at the Pentagon seal. He broke it open. The first line hit his eyes. And everything changed. The color drained from his face. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Robert Halstead stood. Then he reached up and removed his robe. The gallery gasped. Even Daniel sat forward. Judge Halstead folded the robe over the back of his chair with military precision. Then he looked directly at me. His voice was steady and solemn. All rise. My father's face went pale. Wait, he whispered. What? For a second after Judge Halstead said those words, no one moved. The courtroom sat frozen in a kind of stunned confusion, as if every person there had suddenly forgotten what standing even meant. Then the bailiff rose first. He was an old Marine himself, broad in the shoulders, despite his years, and the moment he pushed back his chair, something changed in the room. The clerk stood next. Then the gallery. Then Daniel. And finally my father, though he rose slowly, his face gone so pale I thought he might collapse. I stayed seated. Judge Halstead looked at me not as a judge, not even as a fellow Virginian, but as one service member recognizing another. Then he gave the slightest nod. Only then did I stand. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. No one said another word. Then Halstead cleared his throat, sat again, and carefully pulled his robe back on. The spell broke. He looked older somehow. More human. His eyes settled on my father. Mr. Mercer, he said evenly, you would be wise to remain silent until this court has reviewed all evidence. My father opened his mouth. Closed it. Daniel stared at me like I'd become someone else entirely. And in truth, I had. But becoming that person had cost more than either of them would ever understand. 12 years earlier, I'd stood on another Virginia porch under another September sky. Back then, I was 23, angry enough to mistake anger for courage. The Mercer farm stretched behind me in rows of soybeans and fading pasture grass, all of it glowing gold in the late afternoon light. The kind of land men like my father believed could anchor a family forever. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his face carved from the same hard lines as the Blue Ridge foothills behind our property. You walk down that driveway, he said, don't expect to come back. My duffel bag sat at my feet. Inside was everything I owned. A few clothes, my acceptance papers for officer candidate school with the United States Navy, and the photograph of my mother holding me as a baby, both of us laughing at something beyond the frame. I looked past him into the house where I'd spent my whole life trying to earn love that always seemed reserved for someone else. Daniel was 17 then, already broad-shouldered and confident. Already father's pride. He stood halfway down the hall watching us, that same little smirk already forming. To him, this was confirmation. Abigail was finally proving what everyone knew. That she didn't belong. Mother stepped out behind father, her face pale with worry. Frank, she said softly. He didn't turn. She'll quit in a month, he said. I won't, I answered. He laughed once, low and sharp. You're not built for service, Abby. You've spent your life pretending to be tougher than you are. The words landed exactly where he meant them to. That was his gift. Finding the tenderest part of a person and pressing there until they bent. But then my mother moved around him. She took my hand and placed something cool and heavy into my palm. It was my grandfather's service medal. Bronze worn smooth at the edges from decades of careful handling. My grandfather had earned it in Korea before coming home to farm this same land. Mother closed my fingers over it. You come from stronger people than fear wants you to remember, she said. I nearly cried right there. Not because of father. Because of her. Because she believed in me with a certainty I had never managed to give myself. I left 10 minutes later. Father didn't say goodbye. Daniel didn't wave. Mother stood at the porch rail until my bus disappeared down Cedar Ridge Road. That was the last time I saw her alive. Officer candidate school stripped away every softness I had. The first 6 weeks nearly broke me. Sleep deprivation. Physical punishment. Constant correction. The humiliation of learning that determination alone doesn't make you exceptional. I failed navigation drills twice. Collapsed during a forced march. Got screamed at by instructors who looked at me like I was proof some experiment had gone wrong. More than once I sat on my bunk after lights out and thought about quitting. And every time I heard my father's voice, "You'll wash out in a month." So I stayed. Not out of patriotism at first. Not even pride. Spite. Pure stubborn Mercer spite. Funny what keeps you alive long enough to become something better. Eventually that bitterness burned itself clean. Discipline replaced it. Then confidence. Then purpose. Years later, assignment to Naval Special Warfare Intelligence Support changed everything. The work was classified. The stakes were real. The missions invisible. No medals pinned publicly. No applause. Just responsibility heavy enough to reshape a life. And because secrecy was part of survival, home became impossible. Calls were rare. Letters censored. Visits non-existent. Mother understood. She always understood. Which made what happened next unbearable. I learned she'd died from Margaret Bell nearly 6 weeks after the funeral. A cerebral aneurysm. Quick, they said. No suffering. As if that helped. As if grief measures mercy by minutes. Margaret mailed me Mother's final voicemail. I listened to it alone in government housing in Norfolk at 2 a.m. Her voice was faint but steady. "Abby, if you hear this, then I'm already gone. I need you to know your father is wrong about many things, but especially about you. One day he'll know exactly who you are, and when that day comes, be kinder than he deserves." I played it 12 times. Then I cried harder than I had since childhood. Back in the courtroom, my hands rested steady on the defense table. But inside, that old ache had returned. Not sharp anymore. Just deep. The kind grief becomes when enough years smooth its edges. Judge Halstead looked down at the dispatch again. Then back at my father. And for the first time since this trial began, I saw uncertainty enter Frank Mercer's face. He didn't know what was written there. But somewhere deep down, he already feared the truth. And fear had always been the one thing my father could never hide. Fear has a way of changing a man's face. You don't notice it at first. It hides in little things, the stiffening of the jaw, the restless tapping of fingers, the way the eyes stop meeting yours and begin darting toward exits. That was what I saw now in my father's face, as Judge Halstead folded the Pentagon dispatch and set it carefully on the bench. Frank Mercer had spent his entire life convincing people he was the steadiest man in Cedar Ridge. The man who never panicked. The man who always knew the right answer. The man who built Mercer Agricultural Supply from a 2-room hardware store into the county's largest distributor of seed and fertilizer. People trusted men like that. Respected them. Sometimes even feared disappointing them. I had spent most of my childhood chasing his approval the way some children chase sunlight, certain, if I could only reach far enough it would finally warm me. But fear had found him now. And it looked strangely familiar. Because I had worn that same expression once. Judge Halstead adjusted his glasses. "This court will recess for 15 minutes while I review these materials in chambers." His gavel came down sharply. The room erupted at once. Voices rose. Chairs scraped. People leaned together, whispering. Small-town gossip moved fast, and what had just happened would feed Cedar Ridge for months. Margaret touched my arm. "Come with me." We slipped through the side door into a narrow consultation room with paneled walls and a single humming fluorescent light overhead. It smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish. Margaret closed the door behind us and let out a long breath. "Well," she said, "that certainly landed." I looked at her. She gave a rare smile. At 72, Margaret Bell had spent 40 years practicing law in Virginia and had stared down enough judges, bankers, and self-important local men to qualify as a regional natural disaster. Nothing rattled her. Not even today. "You knew exactly what was in that dispatch," I said. She sat at the small table and folded her hands. "Your mother made sure I would." That tightened something in my chest. Even now, hearing Eleanor Mercer spoken of in the present tense of memory had power enough to steady me. Margaret tilted her head toward the empty chair across from her. "Sit down, Abigail. There's something you need to hear before we go back out there." I sat. Outside the door, muffled courthouse noise drifted through voices, footsteps, the distant clang of the security scanner at the entrance. Ordinary sounds. The kind that made extraordinary moments feel somehow more real. Margaret reached into her leather briefcase and withdrew a sealed manila envelope yellowed slightly with age. My name was written across it in my mother's careful script. I stared at it. "I've held on to this for 6 years," Margaret said quietly, "per your mother's instructions." My throat tightened. "She told me to give it to you only if your father ever forced this matter into open court." For a moment I couldn't breathe. Even dead, my mother had seen farther ahead than anyone else. Margaret slid the envelope toward me. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "Abigail, if you're reading this, then your father has chosen pride over love again." I prayed he would not. But prayer does not erase a man's nature. It only gives us strength to face it. "There is something you must understand. 6 months before I died, Frank came to me desperate. Daniel had mortgaged portions of the Mercer land through speculative investments he did not fully understand. When those ventures failed, your father covered the losses with additional debt. He thought he could recover before anyone knew. He could not. They needed your share of the property to keep creditors from forcing a sale. That is why I changed my will. Not to punish your father. Not even to protect the land. I changed it to protect you. Because I knew if they were desperate enough, they would lie to take what was yours. And because one day, whether your father admits it or not, he will need to face the truth about what he did to his daughter. When that day comes, remember this. Mercy does not mean surrender. Love does not require permission. And your worth was never his to grant. I love you always. Mother." By the time I reached the signature, my vision had blurred. I blinked hard and folded the letter carefully. Margaret said nothing. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. She understood silence better than most people understood speech. After a minute I asked, "How bad is it?" She answered plainly. "Very." She opened another folder. Inside were bank statements, property liens, refinancing records, and corporate filings. The Mercer Company is nearly insolvent. Daniel leveraged future agricultural contracts to secure private loans. Then commodity prices dropped. He doubled down to cover losses. I stared at the numbers. It was worse than I'd imagined. This land is collateral. Yes. I thought of the farm. The maple tree where Mother was buried. The porch swing. The soybean field stretching under September sun. Every memory of home reduced to line items on a debt ledger. If they secure your signature, Margaret said, they can consolidate ownership, refinance again, and delay foreclosure. And if they don't, they lose everything. There it was. The real reason for this lawsuit. Not outrage. Not wounded pride. Desperation. Father had dragged me into court and accused me of impersonating a naval officer because he needed one final signature to save himself. A laugh escaped me, then small and humorless. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What?" "All those years I said I thought he hated me because I disappointed him." Margaret's expression softened. "No, Abigail." She leaned forward. "Your father feared you because your mother saw your strength before he ever could. Men like Frank don't know what to do with what they cannot control." That landed deeper than I expected. Because somewhere beneath every scar he'd left, part of me had still believed I simply hadn't been enough. Margaret reached for her papers again. "There's more." She withdrew another document. A Pentagon release order stamped with federal authorization. 6 weeks ago, portions of your overseas service record were declassified. I stared. "That operation in Izmir." She nodded. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "The extraction mission. The embassy siege. 41 civilians evacuated under live hostile fire. The mission no one outside our command structure was ever supposed to discuss. It's public now. Enough of it is." My breath slowed. And suddenly I understood. Not just what was in Judge Halstead's envelope, but what came next. My father had built this entire case on the assumption that no one could prove who I was. He had gambled everything on secrecy. And secrecy had just expired. A sharp knock sounded at the consultation room door. The bailiff opened it halfway. "Court reconvenes in 2 minutes." Margaret rose. I stood with her. She straightened the front of my dress whites with motherly precision and gave me a small nod. Ready? I thought of my mother's letter folded inside my jacket. Of 12 lost years. Of every insult my father had ever thrown like stones. And for the first time since coming home I felt no anger. Only certainty. Yes, I said. Then we walked back into court where my father was waiting to learn exactly who his daughter had become. When Margaret and I stepped back into the courtroom, the noise died almost at once. That's the thing about small-town courtrooms. They're not grand marble halls like the kind people see on television. Fairfax County's Civil Division sat inside a brick building that had once housed the post office, and the room itself was plain enough oak benches polished by decades of nervous hands, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a state flag standing slightly crooked behind the bench. But when something unusual happened there, the whole place seemed to know. And what had happened 15 minutes earlier was the sort of thing Cedar Ridge would talk about for the next 50 years. The gallery had grown during recess. Word had spread. A few local attorneys stood along the back wall pretending they had business nearby. Mrs. Chandler from the diner sat near the aisle, clutching her purse like she was attending Sunday service. Old Sheriff Collins had appeared too, his weathered face unreadable beneath his white mustache. Everyone had come to see what happened next. My father sat rigid at the plaintiff's table. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, Frank Mercer had always carried himself like a man who expected rooms to part for him, but the certainty had gone out of him. Beside him, Daniel kept adjusting his tie with jerky little motions. His confidence had cracked. He was trying not to show it. Neither of them looked at me. That alone told me enough. Judge Halstead entered through the side door and took his seat without expression. The bailiff called the room to order. Then silence settled. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. Halstead folded his hands and looked first at my father, then at me. His face gave nothing away. But his eyes had changed. There was recognition there now. And something heavier. Respect, perhaps. Or memory. He cleared his throat. This court has reviewed documentation submitted under federal authority by the United States Department of Defense. No one moved. The contents have been independently verified through direct contact with the Pentagon. A murmur passed through the room before the bailiff barked order. Judge Halstead continued. The plaintiff's claim that Abigail Mercer fraudulently impersonated a commissioned naval officer is categorically false. My father's shoulders stiffened. Daniel's face lost color. Halstead reached for the dispatch envelope and withdrew a single typed page. Even from where I sat, I recognized the formatting. Official release language. Precise. Clinical. The kind of words that reduce extraordinary events to dry factual record. The judge adjusted his glasses and began to read. By authority of the Secretary of Defense, selected operational details concerning Commander Abigail Mercer's actions during the emergency diplomatic extraction in Izmir, Turkey, are hereby declassified for legal verification. The courtroom had gone utterly still. I heard someone in the back inhale sharply. Halstead's voice remained measured. On March 14, 2020, Commander Mercer assumed field command after the incapacitation of senior leadership during hostile engagement at the United States diplomatic annex. Daniel blinked rapidly. My father stared as if he'd stopped understanding English. The judge continued. Commander Mercer directed evacuation protocols under active hostile fire, resulting in the successful extraction of 41 American personnel and Allied civilians. Her actions prevented catastrophic loss of life. No one whispered now. No one shifted. It felt as if the room itself had stopped breathing. The words carried me backward whether I wanted them to or not. Izmir had smelled of smoke and concrete dust. The annex alarms had screamed so loudly they became part of the air. Lieutenant Grayson was bleeding out against the communications wall. Commander Patel had gone down 30 seconds earlier. And suddenly command was mine. Not because I wanted it. Not because I was ready. Because everyone else was dead unconscious or trapped. Fear had come then sharp and clean. The kind that narrows your whole world to the next right decision. I remembered shouting coordinates over gunfire. Remembered dragging a wounded diplomat down a stairwell slick with blood. Remembered forcing my own shaking hands to stay steady long enough to clear civilians onto extraction transport. And afterward, once everyone was safe, sitting alone inside the transport hold while my whole body trembled so hard I could barely breathe. That was heroism in real life, not pride. Not glory. Just terror endured one decision at a time. Judge Halstead lowered the page. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, he rose. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his robe again. The fabric slid from his shoulders with a soft rustle. Beneath it, he stood straight-backed, despite his age every inch the Naval Reserve officer he had once been. He faced me. Then he saluted. The movement was crisp enough to make my throat tighten. His voice rang clear through the room. All rise for Commander Abigail Mercer, United States Navy, in recognition of extraordinary service to this nation. The room stood at once. Every person. The bailiff. The clerk. Sheriff Collins. Mrs. Chandler from the diner. Even Daniel, though he looked half-conscious. And my father. My father stood there trembling, staring at me as if seeing his daughter for the first time. I rose and returned the salute. Properly. Steady hand. Locked elbow. Eyes forward. When Judge Halstead lowered his hand, the room sat again. Only my father remained standing. His lips moved soundlessly for a second before words finally came. No, he whispered. The single syllable carried farther than a shout. This isn't possible. Judge Halstead fixed him with a hard stare. It is possible, Mr. Mercer. Father looked at me, panic widening his pale eyes. You lied, he said weakly. And that was when I understood. He needed that to be true. Needed it more than breath itself. Because if I had really done these things, if I had become exactly what he'd sworn I never could, then he would have to confront the full measure of his failure. The judge's voice sharpened. Commander Mercer served where most Americans will never know danger existed. You will address her accordingly. My father's mouth opened. No sound came out. Then Margaret Bell stood. Your Honor, she said, smooth as polished oak, the defense has one final witness. The side door opened, and Daniel's former business partner walked into the room carrying a banker's box full of records. The look on my brother's face told me everything before the man said a word. The real trial was about to begin. The moment I saw Thomas Keegan step through that side door carrying the banker's box, I knew my brother's world had just ended. Daniel knew it too. You could see it happen in real time. His body gave him away before his face did. His shoulders jerked upward like a man bracing for impact, and his right hand, always his tell when he was cornered, began tapping the table in quick, uneven bursts. Tap, tap, tap. He'd done that when we were children, right before confessing to whatever lie had finally collapsed around him. Across the aisle, my father noticed it too. His head turned slowly toward Daniel. For the first time all afternoon, real uncertainty entered his expression. Not fear for himself. Fear of what he might learn about the son he had trusted without question for 37 years. Thomas Keegan was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, and plainly dressed with thinning sandy hair and the weathered face of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He'd grown up 2 farms over from ours. I remembered him from childhood cookouts and county fairs, laughing beside Daniel while the grown-ups swapped stories over barbecue and sweet tea. He had once been Daniel's closest friend. Now he walked to the witness stand without looking at him. That said enough. The bailiff swore him in. Judge Halstead leaned forward. State your name and occupation for the record. Thomas Edward Keegan, agricultural finance consultant. Margaret approached him with measured calm. Mr. Keegan, did you formerly serve as chief financial officer for Mercer Agricultural Supply? Yes. How long? 8 years. And why did your employment end? Thomas hesitated. Then he looked directly at Daniel. Because I refused to sign fraudulent loan disclosures. The room erupted. Judge Halstead's gavel cracked down. Order. My father turned sharply toward Daniel. What is he talking about? Daniel didn't answer. His face had gone gray. Margaret waited for silence, then continued. Please explain to the court. Thomas opened the banker's box and removed a stack of binders thick with tabs and highlighted pages. His voice was steady, but I heard sadness beneath it. Not anger. Regret. About 18 months ago, Daniel began using future crop delivery contracts as collateral to secure short-term private loans. The contracts were inflated, some entirely fabricated. A collective intake of breath swept the gallery. Thomas continued. When commodity prices dropped, the company couldn't cover repayment schedules. Instead of disclosing losses, Daniel refinanced through secondary lenders using portions of Mercer family land as collateral. My father's chair scraped backward. You mortgaged the land. Daniel finally looked at him. It was temporary. Frank's face went white. How much? Daniel swallowed. 4.8 million. The number hit the room like a blast wave. Even Sheriff Collins muttered something under his breath. My father's voice shook now. You told me 200,000. Daniel's mouth worked soundlessly. Margaret stepped closer to the witness stand. Mr. Keegan, did Mr. Mercer Sr. know these figures? Thomas hesitated. And in that hesitation, the whole room leaned forward. Yes, he said quietly. The sound my father made then wasn't quite a word. It was smaller than that. The noise a man makes when his own lies finally become visible to everyone else. Margaret turned toward the bench. Your Honor, Exhibit 12 includes signed refinancing authorizations bearing both plaintiffs' signatures. She handed copies to the clerk, who passed them up. Judge Halstead reviewed them in silence. Across the aisle, my father stared at Daniel as if he'd never seen him before. And perhaps he hadn't. Not really. He had spent a lifetime seeing only what confirmed his own judgment. Daniel was the son who stayed. The son who obeyed. The son who inherited. That had been enough for father to call it goodness. But obedience and character were never the same thing. I had learned that years ago. Now he was learning it too. Margaret spoke again. One final question, Mr. Keegan. Why come forward now? Thomas looked toward me. His expression softened. Because Eleanor Mercer once told me that truth has a way of waiting patiently until people are finally ready to hear it. At the mention of my mother's name, something tightened in my chest. That sounded exactly like her. Margaret nodded and returned to counsel table. The room stayed hushed as Judge Halstead set the documents down. Then he looked directly at my father. Mr. Mercer, would you care to explain why you accused your daughter of fraud while concealing your own financial misconduct? Father rose slowly. For a moment I thought he might answer. Might finally tell the truth. Instead, years of pride surged to the surface one last time. This family was mine to protect, he said, his voice rising. Everything I did was for this family. It was an old refrain. I'd heard versions of it my whole life. Every criticism had been for my own good. Every withheld kindness had been discipline. Every act of control had been protection. For years I'd believed him. I stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. Father looked at me, still flushed with righteous desperation. And suddenly I saw him clearly. Not as the giant of my childhood. Not as the man whose approval had once defined my worth. Just an aging, frightened man who had mistaken possession for love so many times he no longer knew the difference. When I spoke, my voice came calm and even. Number? The word echoed softly. He froze. I held his gaze. It was never yours to protect. His expression faltered. And then I said the truest thing I had ever spoken to him. It was yours to love. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Not theatrical. The kind that settles when something undeniable has finally been said aloud. My father's face changed. The anger drained out of it all at once, leaving only age and grief and something like shame. For the first time in my life, he looked small. Judge Halstead's gavel struck. This court finds in favor of the defendant. Ownership rights remain equally vested under Eleanor Mercer's amended will. Furthermore, this court refers evidence of financial fraud to the Commonwealth Attorney for criminal review. Gasps filled the room. Daniel slumped into his chair. Defeated. Broken. My father didn't move. The gallery slowly began to stir, people whispering, as the truth settled over Cedar Ridge like fresh snow. Margaret touched my arm gently. It's over. But as we gathered our papers, I heard my father's voice behind me. Quiet now. Stripped of command. Abigail. I turned. His pale blue eyes, my own eyes reflected decades older, met mine. Please, he said. Can we talk? And for the first time in my life, he sounded like a man asking instead of demanding. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I nodded once. Outside beyond the courthouse windows, the September sun was already beginning to set. By the time we reached the farm, the last of the daylight had gone soft and copper-colored across the fields. Virginia sunsets always did that in early fall. They didn't disappear all at once the way they did farther south. They lingered, fading slowly over the Blue Ridge as if reluctant to leave. I had forgotten that. Forgotten how the land itself seemed to exhale at dusk. The courthouse crowd had long since scattered. Margaret had driven back toward town after pressing my hand and telling me to call if I needed anything. Daniel had left with his attorney without saying a word. That left only my father and me. He drove separately, his old black Ford pickup rattling slightly the way it always had. I followed behind in my rental sedan, watching the familiar roads unwind beneath the headlights. Past Miller's feed store. Past the white-steepled Baptist church where Mother had sung alto every Sunday for 20 years. Past the weathered sign that read, "Welcome to Cedar Ridge Population 2814. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. When we turned into the long gravel drive of the Mercer farm, something inside me tightened. The farmhouse stood exactly as memory had preserved it. White clapboard siding, wide front porch, green shutters beginning to peel at the edges. The porch swing still hung from its chains near the far rail. Mother's swing. A single lamp glowed inside the front window, casting warm gold across the darkening yard. For one aching second, I could almost believe she'd step through the screen door with 2 glasses of sweet tea and smile as if no time had passed at all. Instead, my father climbed stiffly from his truck and stood waiting beneath the porch light. He looked older here. Smaller. Court had stripped something from him and home had not yet given it back. Neither of us spoke as we climbed the steps. The boards creaked beneath our feet exactly as they had when I was 10 years old, sneaking outside after bedtime to watch thunderstorms roll across the valley. Father sat carefully on the porch swing. He gestured toward the rocking chair beside it. I sat. The quiet stretched between us. Crickets hummed from the fields. A dog barked faintly somewhere down Cedar Ridge Road. Inside the house, the grandfather clock ticked through the open screen door. Ordinary sounds. The kind that make truth harder to avoid. Finally, my father spoke. "She always believed in you." His voice sounded rough, as though it hadn't been used in years for anything honest. I looked out at the darkening fields. "Yes." He nodded once. "She used to tell me I was blind where you were concerned." A dry laugh escaped him. "Turns out she was right." I said nothing. Some silences are invitations. Others are mirrors. This one was both. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his broad hands clasped loosely. Those hands had built this porch. Fixed our tractors. Lifted hay bales and fence posts and all the practical burdens of a farming life. They had also pointed at me in judgment more times than I could count. Age had thickened the knuckles and raised blue veins beneath the skin. For the first time they looked fragile. "When you were little," he said quietly, "you followed me everywhere." The memory surprised me. I hadn't thought of it in years. Him repairing fences while I trailed behind carrying nails too big for my hands. Watching him work with fierce admiration. Certain my father could fix anything. He gave a faint, humorless smile. "You wanted to learn everything, engines, wiring, bookkeeping, didn't matter what it was." His eyes stayed on the porch boards. "And every time I looked at you, I saw how much like Eleanor you were." That caught me off guard. I turned toward him. He kept speaking slower now. She had that same look, like she could already see a better world than the one standing in front of her. His throat tightened visibly. "I loved your mother more than I knew how to say, and somewhere along the way I started resenting anything that reminded me she saw farther than I did." The words landed softly, but their truth hit hard. He rubbed one hand across his mouth. "When you talked about service, about leaving Cedar Ridge, I heard her voice in yours. And I knew if you left, you'd prove something I'd spent my whole life refusing to admit." "What?" He looked at me then. Straight on. That this land wasn't enough. I let that settle. Then I shook my head. "You never understood her." Pain flickered across his face. "No," he said. "I didn't." The honesty in it startled me more than any apology could have. For years I'd imagined this conversation. Imagined rage. Vindication. 1,000 sharp words finally returned. But sitting here now looking at the man age had hollowed and pride had diminished, anger felt strangely unnecessary. Not because what he'd done was small, because it was already finished. The damage had long since shaped us both. Nothing I said tonight could deepen it or erase it. He drew a shaky breath. I was wrong about who you were, Abigail. There it was. Simple. Unadorned. No excuses attached. No conditions. Just truth. His pale eyes glistened in the porch light. The sight unsettled me more than if he'd shouted. Frank Mercer did not cry. Not when his own father died. Not when drought nearly took the farm in '94. Not even at Mother's funeral, from what people told me. And yet now tears stood unshed in his eyes, because he had finally seen his daughter clearly and understood what it had cost to wait this long. I'm sorry, he said. The words came out uneven, like something long rusted finally forced into motion. I believed him. That was the strange part. Not because apology erased anything. It didn't. But because for the first time in his life he was speaking without armor. I sat very still. Then I said the only honest thing I had. I can't give you what you want tonight. His face fell slightly, though he nodded. I know. I'm not ready to forgive all of it. You shouldn't be. The answer surprised us both. A sad little smile touched his mouth. Lord knows I haven't earned that. And somehow hearing him say it loosened something deep inside me. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something quieter. Release. The need to keep carrying this hurt like proof of what had happened. I exhaled slowly. Then reached into my jacket and placed Mother's letter in his lap. He stared at the familiar handwriting and went perfectly still. She knew, I said. He nodded once, unable to speak. I rose from the rocking chair. The night had deepened fully around us now. Stars were beginning to gather over the fields. I'm going to visit her in the morning. He looked up. Would you tell her for me? The question nearly broke me. I swallowed hard, then gave a single nod, and walked down the porch steps into the dark, leaving my father alone with the truth my mother had written years before he was finally ready to read it. The next morning came cool and clear, the kind of Virginia autumn morning that makes the whole world feel newly washed. A thin mist still clung to the lower pasture when I stepped out of the farmhouse just after sunrise. Dew silvered the grass, and somewhere down by the tree line a mourning dove called its soft, familiar song. For a moment I stood on the porch and breathed. The air smelled of cedar and damp earth and distant wood smoke drifting from some neighbor's chimney. Home. Not the version I had spent 12 years resenting. Not the version memory had polished into something softer than truth. The real thing. Weathered. Imperfect. Still standing. I had slept poorly. Not from anger. That was gone now, or at least changed into something quieter. No, what kept me awake had been the strange lightness settling inside me. For so many years I had carried my father's judgment like a second skin. Even after promotions, commendations, impossible missions survived, and impossible decisions made, some hidden part of me had still been waiting for him to tell me I had finally done enough. That hunger had shaped more of my life than I cared to admit. And now it was simply absent. Not fulfilled. Gone. Like waking one morning to discover an old injury no longer aches when the weather changes. I walked across the backfield toward the maple tree where my mother was buried. The grass brushed softly against my shoes. Beyond the pasture, the Blue Ridge Mountains rose blue-gray against the brightening sky, steady as they had been every day of my life. Mother had chosen this spot herself after Granddad died. She used to joke that if she had to spend eternity anywhere, she preferred a view. The maple stood halfway down the slope, its leaves blazing orange and red in the early sun. Beneath it sat two modest headstones. My grandfather's. And hers. I knelt before Eleanor Mercer's grave and laid my hand against the cool granite. For a long while I said nothing. Grief changes with age. When it first arrives, it is sharp enough to split you open. Years later, it becomes companionship. A quiet presence walking beside you through ordinary days. I took my grandfather's bronze service medal from my pocket. The same one Mother had pressed into my hand 12 years earlier. The edges were smooth now from years of carrying it overseas across oceans and deserts and places whose names would never appear in public record. It had sat in my breast pocket during operations where fear felt close enough to taste. A reminder of where I came from. A reminder that courage often looks smaller and plainer than people expect. I placed it carefully at the base of her headstone. Then I spoke. "He read your letter." The breeze stirred the maple branches overhead. I smiled faintly. He finally listened. A lump rose in my throat. For a second I was 23 again, standing at that bus stop with my whole life packed into a duffel bag, terrified and pretending not to be. Only now I understood what Mother had known all along. Leaving hadn't been rebellion. It had been becoming. And coming back wasn't surrender. It was proof that home could be reclaimed without being reduced by it. I stayed there until the sun climbed high enough to burn away the mist. Then I rose and walked back toward the house, feeling strangely certain about what came next. 3 months later, Cedar Ridge Veterans Retreat opened its doors. The Mercer land had been divided by court order. Daniel took the business assets and spent most of his share paying legal settlements. He left Virginia shortly after chasing some fresh start in North Carolina, from what little I heard. My father remained on the farm. We spoke occasionally. Briefly. Carefully. Healing, I had learned, is rarely dramatic. It moves like roots underground, quiet, invisible, slow. Some weeks later, he began volunteering at the retreat. No speeches. No explanations. He fixed broken fence rails, repaired plumbing, mowed the grounds. Service in the language he understood best. That was enough. The retreat itself had grown from a simple idea. A place where aging veterans could rest, recover, and remember they were not forgotten. Nothing fancy. Just 12 renovated guest cottages, walking trails through the backwoods, a common dining hall, and wide porches built for conversation. The kind of place people over 60 seem to understand instinctively. A place where no one needs to explain old scars. On opening day, our first guest arrived, retired Army Sergeant Walter Hensley, age 78, Vietnam veteran, widower hands, trembling slightly from Parkinson's. He stepped onto the porch of Cottage 3 and looked out over the fields for a long moment. Then he turned to me with tears standing openly in his eyes. "I haven't felt peace this quiet in 40 years, he said. I didn't know what to say. So I simply stood there with him, letting the silence hold what words could not. After a while he smiled. "You know," he said, "the strongest people I ever knew weren't the loud ones." I thought of my mother instantly. Walter looked out at the fields again. They were the ones who stopped needing to prove who they were. The words settled deep. That evening, after guests had finished supper and the sky had begun its slow copper fade across Cedar Ridge, I stood alone on the main porch and watched the light go. Somewhere behind me, laughter drifted from the dining hall. Soft. Real. Earned. And I finally understood what honor meant. It was never the uniform. Not really. Not the medals or salutes or classified commendations hidden in Pentagon files. Those things mattered, yes, but they were symbols. Honor lived somewhere quieter. In truth told late, but told anyway. In wounds carried without bitterness. In choosing to build where others once tried to break. That day in court, everyone rose because of the uniform I wore. But I finally stood because I no longer needed it to know my worth. If this story brought you back to your own memories of family, of service, of the long road toward forgiveness, I hope you'll carry that reflection forward. Share it with someone who may need it, and if stories like this speak to your heart, you're always welcome here. Some truths take a lifetime to hear. Sometimes they're still worth hearing. The end.